You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the 1984 3D sci-fi comedy film Hyperspace, aka Gremloids. Here we go. Shall we get into a little hemorrhoids? I mean Gremloids, Pete?
You took one of my jokes.
Sorry. Right out of the gate, I already stole one. And we're going to steal some of your time because this is the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez, and Pete Charbonneau, co-host extraordinaire, joining me to watch as many 80s 3D films as we can. In this one, we may show some of our battle scars on Gremloids, aka Hyperspace.
We may. I think this is the episode where we ask which is more painful, because the two rhyme, Gremloids and hemorrhoids. I don't know if we're going to have an answer to that. I will say up front, with full disclosure, I'm not proud to admit it. I did not make it through this movie. I tried my best. You know, this is for science. This is for the podcast. This is for, our friendship.
Thanks, Pete.
I don't know if I hit an Earl wall or it was rough, but I will say, because we've been tackling a lot of Earl Owensby films, I shut this one off to watch Tales of the Third Dimension. And that episode, I think you'll see that we had a pretty enjoyable time discussing that one.
That's right.
We'll do our best with Gremloids, aka Hyperspace. I guess it depends. If you're in the UK, it's Gremloids. If you are in the US, it's Hyperspace.
If you're in Germany, it's actually Gremlords.
Gremlords?
It's Gremlords in Germany.
Gremlords?
That's right. Again, we're watching these movies, Silent Madness, Rottweiler, aka Dogs of Hell, which introduced us to Earl Owensby, Coming at Ya, which arguably started this whole 3D 80s craze. Treasure of the Four Crowns, we had on Austin Trunick, the man who literally wrote the books on Canon Films, and we talked about that Indiana Jones ripoff, which was a lot of fun. We journeyed into space twice, one in Space Hunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, and a second time in Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin, both of which you saw in the theater, Pete.
That's my indie cred card right there.
And we also saw the Charles Band-directed Parasite, 1982. So we've ventured down this 3D road, and when we discovered Earl Owensby, the Cecil B. DeMacho, I just love saying that, of the South.
Although some people have called him the Cecil B. DeMille of the South, Earl is amused at the comparison. DeMille was known for his great epics like the Ten Commandments, with casts of thousands, and Earl had few characters in his movies, to say nothing of extras, and hardly ever used a big-name star. Most of the time, he used hometown people: the barber, the high school teacher, the shoe salesman, the man who worked at the drugstore or at the garage, and a host of people that were just down home, the way Earl was and is, and it worked.
A man who made a ton of drive-in, exploitation, grindhouse films that were released in the Bible Belt, not much distribution outside of the Southeast. And that's okay, because the man worked with small budgets and had a high return on his investments.
But let's remember, when I went in the movie business, I had only one place to go with my movie, and that was to either the theaters or the drive-ins, or I didn't go. I mean, there was no video, there was no cable. There was no place like Home Box Office, Showtime. There was no pay-per-view. None of that stuff exists. And so to roll those dice and get into that business at that time, I think, and build a studio in Shelby, North Carolina, would probably have been a $1 million to 1 shot at least, yeah.
And this is not to say that the man made cheap productions. If anything, Pete and I have been pleasantly surprised by some of the cinematography, some of the acting, and the mileage varies. But we've always had fun watching these movies. And I think going into steal two of your lines, Pete, between the hemorrhoids and now earnest awfulness, because I think the thing you cannot take away from Mr. Owensby is that the man loved filmmaking, loved producing films, produced 30 some of them. And now that he's on our radar, as we keep unearthing yet another movie he made in 3D, it's always impressive that the man has made this much and has not been on our radar.
Absolutely. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, Earl Owensby was very much aware that he was ripping off other better, more big budgeted films. He had a bit of a disdain for Hollywood.
Never say never to Mr. Earl Owensby. Yes, he knew what people were saying, but since when did that really matter? He was going to show the Hollywood establishment what he could do without them, period.
I think one of the interesting things about the opposition to Hollywood, if I can use that term, is that it spurred him. In other words, it was an obstacle, it was a detriment, but at the same time, this is what drove him, was that conflict and the need to prove that he could do this. So it actually made the films possible.
He just wanted to make movies, but he had the wherewithal, the gumption, if you will, and the ability to kind of make them on his own terms. And he cornered this market of South Carolina film. I mentioned it, I think, for Rottweiler. It reminded me a lot of like early wrestling territories where he kind of had locked down South Carolina. That was his territory. And, you know, it was bringing in friends, people in the area that did multiple jobs. You could be an editor and the director of a film. You could write one and maybe produce a score on another one.
I have always reached back and to who I was comfortable with, to use the people that I'm comfortable with. Somebody said he uses friends. Well, I ain't gonna use my enemies. I don't want no dude don't like me on my payroll.
This helped him keep costs down. It allowed him to churn out movies pretty quickly. I think they had, you know, some of them were in theaters on limited runs in the area within a couple of weeks at the end of filming.
We were finishing a movie on Saturday night, usually right at dark, and starting a new one on Monday morning. You know, we didn't know we'd finish that one and start another one. So it wasn't no, you know, we had a regular 8-to-5 job, or a little longer than that, but, you know, 6 days a week, continuously. And that's unheard of in the movie business. It's just unheard of.
Take the Roger Corman route and try to sell these overseas, which is where I think he made a lot of his money.
I accidentally stumbled into the overseas market. Cinemation Industries picked up Challenge and paid me a lot of money. And they distribute it worldwide. And when they went bankrupt, we got Challenge back. And when we got Challenge back, we got the books and the auditing on it. And that's how I realized there's an international market. I mean, people over in South Africa paid $20,000 for the rights to show it. In Germany, I think $80,000. I said, wait a minute, you mean these people buying? I just thought about, when I made the movie, I thought, well, I'll get in Georgia and Northern South Carolina. I ain't going to be New York, Hollywood. And all of a sudden it was there. So I started making movies, and I really didn't care whether they ever was released here or not. It didn't matter to me. It didn't make no difference at all. I thought, hey, you don't play it, don't want to play it, don't worry about it. Because I had that cash flow coming from the international market.
Getting $10 million returns on $1 million film. So
That's
he
right.
had a great system working for a number of years.
Let's have no question about it. Earl went into the motion picture industry because it's been a love of his from the very beginning. But he did it principally as a financial venture. And as Earl says, economics is easy. You don't spend as much as you take in. And he was able to do that and build a very successful studio.
Clearly had his finger on the pulse of what people in that region wanted to see, and he churned that out. You know, he starred in a bunch of them.
Earl's movies have been criticized for less than excellent acting or for the lack of good plots and dialogue. But Earl has no aspirations of being the next Sir Laurence Olivier, and no one has to worry about him playing Hamlet or Macbeth or Othello. That's the way Earl wants it. And it's probably the way everyone else wants it, too.
He had no right turning into an actor. What the heck was that? And yet there he was.
He is admittedly was not a good actor. He wasn't there. He was basically have a couple of lines a movie, and he was there to basically either punch or shoot the bad guys. And that's what he did in stuff from Challenge to Chain Gang to Rottweiler, where he was unfortunately shooting a bunch of what seemed to be adorable Rottweiler dogs. But we had fun with that one anyway. Yeah. So, you know, I guess it stands to reason that at some point he was going to tackle taking on, you know, Star Wars, but rather than do a ripoff of Star Wars, they went the satire route with Hyperspace.
I'm glad that you brought up two things. One is that you brought up Corman. You know, we've talked about it before. If there's a group picture with Corman and Larry Coleman and Charles B. Pierce, and you can even squeeze in Ed Wood into that picture, you know, you'd have Earl Owensby somewhere in the corner, but he hasn't gotten the fanfare of a Corman or a Kaufman. But now that we've kind of discovered him, We don't give him short shrift. If anything, we admire what he was able to accomplish. And then how you mentioned he starred in a lot of his films. A little piece of trivia I forgot when we talked about Chain Gang, he was going to hire David Jansen, who was the star of the Fugitive TV series, to be Frank Challenge in his first movie that was released. That was, again, kind of a ripoff of, like you said, he rips off the big budgets. Frank Challenge, Manhunter, was a ripoff of Walking Tall and Billy Jack. So he goes to David Jansen's agent and says, hey, you want to star in this film? And I guess he asked for $500,000 for 3 or 4 days work. And when he realized that he could either give David Jansen, the Hollywood star, well known, I can give him the money, or I can just keep it and put it on the screen and I'll be, I'm good enough. And in some ways he's kind of like a Joe Don Baker. So he's a little bit barrel-chested and a bit of a strong silent type. He doesn't give himself the long monologues because I think he was aware, like you've mentioned before, he's not Shakespeare. His strong suit was making low-budget movie and getting it on screens. And unfortunately, now those movies seem to be harder to find. So we've discovered a lot of these films on YouTube, including Gremloids that we're going to talk about, which is another perfect example of a trend that he took advantage of. Because maybe the fun in this one, Pete's going to be talking about what inspired Gremloids. 1977, Pete, A New Hope is released. And I think fair to say this one has so much DNA from that first installment in like Star Wars in the franchise. And then Empire comes out in 80, Jedi comes out in 83. This comes out in 84. And it's wearing it on its sleeve. There's so much Star Wars in this. And in a lot of the ways where there were all the Star Wars clones, one that I know is a favorite of yours, Battlestar Galactica. I think that movie came out in 78. And then talking about Corman, 1980, you had Battle Beyond the Stars. That was kind of like a Seven Samurai-ish ripoff, but, with a lot of Star Wars in there. A movie that I know your dad did not enjoy, 1980's Flash Gordon. And I have to imagine if you're Dino De Laurentiis, well, let's just go get like that pulp character that I saw in the Sunday strips, and let's kind of do that, but with a little bit more humor. And that's Flash Gordon, Turkish Star Wars, very much inspired by Star Wars. Star Crash, that was another Corman film, I believe. And I forget the actress's name, but she was in some of those Hammer horror films.
Caroline Munro.
Thank you. Yes. All inspired by Star Wars. Gremloids, in the same conversation, probably closer to Spaceballs than any of the others that I mentioned.
Which it precedes by a couple of years.
That's right.
Spaceballs was 88. So tackling the satire ahead of Mel Brooks. And I want to say someone from this production, maybe the writer, went on to do Hotel Transylvania.
That's right. Todd Durham. Yep. He created the concept for Hotel Transylvania, script doctor on the Lampoon movies, on, I guess, some SNL projects.
I have not seen the Hotel Transylvania movies, but I do know that Mel Brooks has a voice role in one of those movies. So
there's some connection there.
Yeah. There's some tethers to that. So I think Mel Brooks, and maybe through this gentleman I'm guessing Mel did not see this, or maybe he did, who knows, really become aware of a movie like Gremloids at some point in time. I'm not going to say that inspired him to do Spaceballs. I think, Mel Brooks has a sterling track record of
that's right
spoofing and satire film genres. So he didn't need Gremloids to be like, I needed the template to do this to Star Wars, what I did with Blazing Saddles and History of the World and all this other comedies. But so we've got, and I say I didn't make it through this movie, but I will say when I started to watch it, one of the issues I had, and we've talked about this with previous episodes, is we're watching an uploaded VHS copy on YouTube.
Yes.
And I feel like this one was particularly rough in that the lighting was difficult. It was kind of hard to see what was going on. The sound wasn't great. So I was kind of getting lost in a lot of, some of those finer details, and I was losing my patience. And I also knew that I had another Earl movie to watch, so that kind of jettisoned me off of this one. But
which would also have tracking issues as well.
Which would also have tracking issues. But, this thing opens up with a pretty good rendition of the opening Star Wars crawl.
Oh, hands down. Yeah.
It's pretty, they nailed that.
Yep. That opening crawl in a galaxy far, far away, dead on. I think this was, is it episode 4, The Last Resort already? Yeah. This is, I see what you're doing. This is kind of fun. The crawl has all of the space mythology gobbledygook that you would expect. There's two sides and they're fighting, and there's a princess, and they're fighting to save the universe as we know it. Okay, got it.
And the bad guys take a wrong turn and end up on Earth.
and the spaceship itself, all things being equal. And again, this is where VHS is an unrelenting mistress, I would say, Pete, because sometimes it gives you the nostalgia that you just love. Because when you see the tracking, you're just like taken back to being a kid and maybe getting that VHS that someone paused a bit too many times. But nevertheless, you're like, I love it. This is good. And then there's times like this where the struggle is real and the VHS uploaded to YouTube makes it hard to decipher what's going on. And in some ways, maybe that's a saving grace for this because the effects weren't great, but they were way better than I expected. And you can hide a lot of crap with VHS tracking lines. And that spaceship in the beginning, Lord Buckethead's spaceship, it doesn't look terrible. It's better than I expected, considering that our frame of reference is Rottweiler, aka Dogs of Hell, the Jaws with Paws, Chain Gang, and Tales from the Third Dimension 3D, where maybe the biggest effect was Igor, the skeleton. And you could certainly see the strings that was pulling our skeleton pal. This one, I was like, wow, when you go for a Star Wars parody, you kind of know what you're getting in for. You're going to have to do a few things, laser blasts and spaceships. And hey, got to commend Earl. He's like, if this is what the folks like, and, we've seen the lines, let's give the people what they want, with $1 million budget.
Right. Laser blast sounds aside, I don't know how the rest of the movie goes, but the beginning after the opening crawl literally lifted from Star Wars. Like those are the exact sound effects. But full marks to, again, the technical crew, first using miniature models that they I don't think had previously produced before in a movie, breaking ground there. And again, going back to the crawl, from what I remember from years ago watching making of Star Wars documentaries, I believe the crawl was like printed on a pane of glass, and you had like a stationary camera kind of move down the pane of glass, and then the Starfield VFX was kind of overlaid after. Not a down and dirty basic way to shoot something like that. So I don't know if they did the exact same technique, but it certainly looks
it worked.
Like they did, or it looks the same and it works. So again, like the technical work being done, and we've talked about this, like low budget, yes, but this is not amateurish work. Like these people know what they're doing, and you have to give them a lot of credit because, I mean, yes, this one is a satire and a parody, but a lot of these films are done straight and maybe with some comedic elements, but they would certainly devolve into laugh out loud parody if it was done with a lesser hands doing the work behind the camera. And this is clearly done by a competent crew that he had working with. And so it shows in things like that.
100%. Yeah. The plot itself, not to say that I was like, oh, Pete, surprise, it was great. And there were some things in there that even you could tell Lucas lifted for the prequel series. No, none of that is true. The poster and the soundtrack for this are better than I think the film deserves. Shout out to Don Davis, who did the music for this. He's just tuning in Star Wars, like the entire way. I guess he worked on a few TV shows, Beauty and the Beast, Sequest DSV. Was it Deathstalker 2 we talked about that had pieces of John Williams' score? But the music stood out just like in this. And I think that also is this sounds like Star Wars. It's not, doesn't have the production of Star Wars. So Lord Buckethead and his Jawas make a wrong turn, end up on Earth. They scare these two fishermen who then later on go to the authorities to report that they may have seen an alien arrive on Earth. At the same time, these kids who are with their parents, just, hanging out, enjoying a nice evening, suddenly are now assaulted by these little Jawa creatures that have invaded their basement. So the two parents, who realize that they're a little bit over their head because these aren't cockroaches, call an exterminator. And I swear to God, that exterminator, the pest control guy, is played by Arnie Horshack from Welcome Back, Kotter. I can't prove it, but it feels right. He shows up the next morning. They've literally hammered the basement door, and Arnie goes down there, realizes nothing's there. Everyone's excited. but the Jawas have escaped to our friend Arnie, who works for Terminex, into his van. And then now the plot really begins because we realize that these Jawas are looking for the plans. And just like in Star Wars, Darth Vader wanted the plans. He wanted the plans returned. So does Lord Buckethead. Looks like Darth Vader with a bucket for a head.
Looks like the Black Knight from
yes,
Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yes, that little Monty Python element to there. So I appreciate that.
Where have you hidden the plans?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, because I'm sure we'd be happy to... Let me see. They're around here somewhere.
These little moments that they've thrown in there to just kind of lean into the ridiculousness of having a Darth Vader type character walking through, for example, a middle of a town, and he goes into a donut shop, which again, the name of the donut shop in the front said bread cakes. I've never heard the phrase bread cakes used in place of donuts, but the guy who owns this donut shop is a baker who Lord Buckethead says, hey, you kind of look like Captain Starfighter, like a Han Solo, Flash Gordon type character in space. He's like, no, you have me confused with somebody else. Also, would you like some fritters? They're on sale. And the Jawas literally seize the fritters. They escape because they need to find the plans because they're looking for this princess. They go into an Amco shop where they meet our friend Leon Rippey, who shows up quite a few times. He was in Chain Gang. He was in Tales from the Third Dimension in 3D. And now he is in here again as a mechanic. Paula Poundstone is the front desk clerk that helps him out. And when Lord Buckethead walks in, literally a guy with a bucket for a head and a cape with little Jawas, it's like, hey, I'm looking for the princess. And then Paula Poundstone comes out and Lord Buckethead is like, oh, you must be the princess. So he starts accosting her. Where are the plans? Turns out they like grab this engine that's sitting in the back room that they kind of mistake for a droid.
Shop vac. Yeah.
A shop vac. That's right. It's ridiculous, Pete, because I mean, that's kind of what this is. It's just like Lord Buckethead. We need the plans. Where are the plans? And then Arnie gets into the picture because he runs into Paula Poundstone. So now they're kind of intertwined. They end up getting kidnapped by Lord Buckethead and the Jawas. They basically like kind of brainwash or like temporarily numb our friend Arnie Horshack. I know that's not his name, but let's just go with it. There's like a grocery cart chase scene with some of the best, no worst CGI you've ever seen, but I loved it. It was amazing. Chris Elliott gets introduced when the government arrives because those fishermen were not crying wolf. There are aliens and they have to do something about it. And he comes in full Robert Shaw Quint fashion with the fingernails on the chalkboard. Guys, we got to do something. There's actual aliens. And the army assembles. They have a face-off at Lord Buckethead's spaceship. And at the very end, Pete, spoiler alert, it turns out our baker was indeed Captain Starfighter the whole time. He was hiding on Earth where he retired from being a space adventurer and opened up a bake shop or bread cake shop. He saves the day wearing leotard that's just a little bit too tight for a man of his age and build. But nevertheless, Lord Buckethead does not get the plans, and the end.
If it would be okay if we surrendered. That is, if it's all right with you.
No prisoners. Prepare to die.
And there it is, folks. Gremloids, a.k.a.
That's the movie.
The jokes were reminding me of, it was like basically throw everything at the wall and taking almost like lines of Star Wars dialogue verbatim. But
yes,
it's funny because they're on Earth and they're in a shopping, they're in a grocery store. And yes, there's definitely some comedic, gold to be mined from like seeing like Lord Buckethead walking in, to the supermarket. And it's, it's all very ridiculous.
May I help you?
Browsing.
Where are the transmissions? So they have to go to Amco Transmissions because where else? Of course, that's where you have to go. And, I see you've hidden the plans in this droid, which is the shop vac. So there's very on the nose jokes. And I will say there was a legit laugh from me at the beginning.
Okay.
When the Jawas in the basement and the parents don't think they believe the kids that they've seen something. The dad goes down there. He's like, he comes back up and he's like, we got to call the exterminator as you recapped earlier.
Yep.
And then the exterminator gets grabbed by the Jawas, getting dragged down the steps. And so the dad goes to like hurl something down, and he grabs the meatloaf that the mother is making. And
That's
she
right.
yells out, "No, not the meatloaf," which I thought was actually very well done and very funny. So I'll give it some credit, even though I did not finish the movie. There were some moments.
There was a scene where Buckethead and the Jawas go into the donut shop, and as he's literally walking through Main Street, it's supposed to be dramatic, and as they're approaching the donut shop, they literally cut to the baker and his assistant as they're hearing the score as it's crescendoing. So there were a few little moments there where, when we talk about like Spaceballs did it better. But I appreciate this movie for even trying to do it at all. I'm not being reductive. It's comedy. It's hard. It's a Star Wars parody. It's effects and it's comedy. That's harder. Like, why play the game in hard mode when you could do Chain Gang, where it's just Earl Owensby running in a swamp with an Uzi? But this, I'll give him credit. The music, the effects, the laser blast looked like laser blast. The scene wipes, they looked authentic to Star Wars. So I appreciate the nods to that, and knowing that anyone who saw this would look at it and say, this just feels like a cheap Star Wars kind of movie, greenlit because of the success of Star Wars. Yeah. So that's where I appreciate this, in that Earl Owensby, a man who made movies that were a little bit more grounded, decided to kind of stretch his wings with a production that had special effects, that featured comedy, featured a young Paula Poundstone and Chris Elliott. And I guess Chris Elliott at the time was on the Late Late Show with Letterman. He was just starting to be on there. The fact that he's able to work with some of these up and coming actors, the movie wasn't great, but again, Earl Owensby always delivers, always gives us something entertaining. The one thing I was reminded about this movie is that Lord Buckethead and John Oliver in Last Week Tonight. In short, like the guy who Mike Lee, he was the video distributor of Gremloids in the UK. So in order to promote the movie, he basically creates a fictitious political party called the Gremloids Party. And he runs a candidate called Lord Buckethead, after the character in the movie. And he runs in 1987 against conservative UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher as a way to promote the film. He got 100 votes. So there's no such thing as bad publicity. Well, you got 100 votes for this. And I guess that's something. I don't know if that got more people to watch the movie, but who's to say? But that idea stayed on because then in 1992, he ran against some other prime minister. He got another 100 votes. And then he did it again in 2017. But at that point, I think he was running against Nigel Farage. And there was kind of a idea that, Nigel Farage was probably not be a good thing to have in office because of his beliefs. So he didn't want to deviate good votes from those that might be going against Nigel Farage. So he bowed out of the race. And at this point, Buckethead was taken on by another comedian, no longer Mike Lee.
And for the record, Lord Buckethead is this guy, an intergalactic space lord who ran on a platform of, among other things, the abolition of the lords, brackets, except me, and stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia, start buying lasers from Lord Buckethead. And he did this all while looking like Darth Vader fucked an Amazon Echo. What I'm saying is, British politics, when done well, can be very fun. Not a great sign that the single most honest statement from any candidate in this election regarding the difficulty of the task ahead came from a man with a 2-foot bucket on his head.
Your Prime Minister, your MP, Theresa May, called this election about Brexit. Have we heard from her what she plans to do about Brexit? No. This is mad. On Thursday, you are going to be faced with Prime Minister May or Prime Minister Corbyn against 27 Prime Ministers from the European Union. It will be a shit show.
I never thought I'd say this, But that intergalactic space lord has a point.
But just the fact that all of this exists and that John Oliver featured it on Last Week Tonight, of all the movies we've seen, Pete, the fact that we've never heard of Earl Owensby, we stumble onto these movies because we're just watching a bunch of 3D films, and here's this thing that's randomly connected to a political party, although somewhat fictitious, I guess, in the UK. This is nuts.
It's wild. And again, I talked about this on a previous episode, but I'm loving that we're uncovering that it's new to us. I know that there's, I'm sure, a segment of people out there that may know of all this trivia or know the backstory on Earl Owensby and his filmmaking endeavors. But for us, this is such new. You can argue how fertile the ground is that we're uncovering. But, there's a lot to like about. We've enjoyed watching most of these movies for what they are. And to know that he had like this little world that was his for what they are, like these are good looking productions, low budget, but good looking. And so again, there's talented people involved with this. So it's wild to me. And I'll echo a point that you made earlier about him kind of stretching his boundaries a little bit with making a satire of Star Wars with this, because he clearly could have just kept mining that market of wronged man seeking revenge thing. Yep. And he probably could have kept churning that out, starred in them, not starred in them, whatever, and done pretty well for himself. But he clearly wanted to be more than just that. I know he had ambitions of, making this, a bigger production than it was, not necessarily challenge Hollywood, but to at least establish that you could make independent films outside of the Hollywood bubble and be successful. I mean, I think at the very least, he's a tremendous success story in that regards. Like, it kind of boggles my mind that there hasn't been more written about him. And maybe that's by design. I don't know too much. I know we're uncovering some things as we do our research because we're interested, but I don't know too much about the details. He's still alive, I believe. And there's a website that you can go to. But like, as you said, like they've made really no effort to convert any of this stuff to DVD or to offer it streaming anywhere. So it remains in many ways kind of like stuck in this time capsule, kind of just waiting to be discovered by people like us. And that's a great thing. Part of me kind of wants that little extra push so that more people can be made aware of it. Again, like your mileage will vary as to how much you enjoy going back and seeing some of this stuff. I think being
or finishing some of these movies, maybe.
Or finishing, yeah, the case maybe. Thank you. And I think, how old you are might have some bearing on that.
Yes.
Because we have the nostalgia factor of growing up, going to video stores and getting movies like this, if not these movies, because we didn't know they existed. So it's all very fascinating to me. I'm loving this movie aside and not finishing it. I'm still loving this whole journey that we've been on and uncovering, just way more films than we thought were out there to tackle with these 80s 3D movies.
Yep. I think a good way to maybe end this episode, maybe where you started in the beginning talking about Spaceballs, how this comes out.
Hemorrhoids. Sorry.
No. This comes out in 84, Spaceballs in 87. It kind of reminded me a little bit of, so you get in the spaghetti Western genre, right? Like you get the Sergio Leone trilogy for a few dollars more, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And then as that was kind of losing steam, you really had at the end of that Western spaghetti Western era, My Name is Trinity, My Name is Nobody, comedic Westerns that was almost like slapstick, where the gunfighter would take out his gun and in almost like Blazing Saddles like satire be too quick on the draw. But you could tell that you're working on the trope established by Clint Eastwood. And if you get those movies, then you'll get the joke this is working with. Like, this guy is too quick of a draw. So now it's just mining the comedic piece of it. And when you think about Jedi coming out in 83 and then this coming out in 84, you have to imagine like Mel Brooks at some point, he's starting to develop what would become Spaceballs. And yet a few years before Spaceballs is even out on the screen, you have Earl Owensby in the South in his, like you said, his world, making this movie that would not be easy for him to make. And considering some of the films we've seen in his catalog, it's not like he makes a lot of sci-fi films. So the fact that this had sci-fi elements, another nod to Earl Owensby in that before Spaceballs, but certainly after Star Wars, was Hyperspace.
Earl Owensby, the man, the myth. A hometown boy, a millionaire. A Sunday school teacher, a sometimes preacher. A North Carolina good old boy. And a rebellious filmmaker. Earl Owensby, an intriguing man by all accounts. His life reads like an open book. The only problem is, sometimes Earl holds the only copy. Now you know, the man and the myth.